Get started. Today our format is somewhat like a European talk show. Why? Because European talk shows provide great moments for conversation, also moments to get a bit deeper. If you look in the front, we've got a map of Charlottesville here. We also have sections that are up on the wall that take you through the city, so make sure you get a chance to take a look at those. I'd like to thank, before we get started, the Howland family. Thank you very much for this time. Well, give a round of applause to them. So if you look in your program, we're going to work in blocks. Sara, Frank, and myself will show our ideas. We'll talk with the past, present, and future. We'll take a discussion amongst us. Then we'll go to the second group, Alexa, Kofi, and Azzurra. And then the last group will be Amber and Garnette. After that, by the power of rotation, we will turn around and have an open discussion. Power of rotation. All right, so let's get started. Sara, thank you. Sara. Right.
For the Akan people of West Africa, proverbs are the source of inspiration for craft and visual art, including gold weights like this 15th century artifact. This bird is called Sankofa, which in the language of Twi means go back and get it. And it's used to express a philosophy of time that's remnant throughout the West African diaspora. The bird's feet are often depicted in an active stance, firmly in the present, suggestive of moments of movement and readiness. In the past, the head is turned backwards, picking up an egg, the embryonic form from which worlds emerge. But the body is lunging forward towards the future. And so together, this bird represents directionality, a philosophy of time. That's not linear, rather it's a spiral moving towards the future, actively pulling from the past through the energy of the present. This language of Twi is spoken in Winneba, Ghana, which is one of Charlottesville's official sister cities. So in the spirit of sisterhood and shared history, I want to use this concept of Sankofa to organize my thoughts today. Starting with the present. The present is a moment marked by, as Walter mentioned last night, a flagrant sense of political tensions, and yet somehow a reticence to dialogue openly. The present is also this moment now where we're gathered today to talk about designing in that very context. And so like the Sankofa bird, we are ready to act in the present, but we must go back and get it from the past. And the past was yesterday. The past was when this flyer was placed on Elisa Diamond's doorstep, who's a doctoral student here. The past includes the events of August 11 and 12, 2017. The past includes this day in 1964 when 500 families were moved into the West Haven projects, right after the neighborhood of Vinegar Hill was razed. The past includes the 1963 protests at Buddy's Restaurant up on Emmett Street. The past includes the 1960 referendum when Charlottesville voters authorized the razing of Vinegar Hill. That was right after a city survey found that 29 black-owned businesses in Vinegar Hill had a combined gross income of $1.6 million. The past includes decades of hard work and determination building a self-sufficient neighborhood. The past includes constructing your own civic, commercial, and religious institutions to celebrate your history and your culture. The past includes the dedication of statues like this one. The past includes the demolition of black-owned property to build parks to put them in. The past includes lashings at the public whipping post and hangings at Court Square. The past includes when free and enslaved blacks were required to report to fight for the Confederate States of America. The past includes the past includes physically building the city and the university and creating its wealth by virtue of free labor. The past includes slave auctions on court days at auction houses in front of public buildings, at the courthouse to settle debts owed to the county. The past includes 1619, when the very first Africans were brought to America, landed at Jamestown, just 100 miles from where we sit. So what we learn when we go back and get it is that African people were the central centrifugal force in the formation of Charlottesville over 400 years. So the city of Charlottesville itself is an archaeology of the past. And that past is everywhere. It's every day. So it's not just trauma, although it is that. It's rage, it's discomfort, but it's also joy and laughter and triumph. It's a wide range of emotions because it's your entire life. But the typology of the memorial is rooted in classical notions of monumentality. It's a discrete object referencing a hero, a war, a tragedy. You go there to feel a sense of pain or guilt or reverence for a moment, and then you return to the rhythms of your everyday life. So there's a disconnect between the memory that we're talking about today, this layered past, and what designers tend to use to talk about history. So I submit that the future of designing for memory in Charlottesville is an opportunity to resolve that disconnect. I submit to you 3 tenets of that future. One is to design expansively. I propose the memorial as an expanded concept or a constellation of sites of memory interwoven in the everyday life of the city. All of the places that I flashed through still exist in some form today. So where are they? You know, who owns them? How can we intervene? So, you know, I think that this exercise sort of should begin with a mapping and a documentation of these sites. So in the project that I worked on in Rio around the archaeology of slavery in the downtown region, you know, I went through this practice of mapping the infrastructures of the city. I mean, you need a city to buy and sell and ship and trade millions of people. And so we took that mapping exercise, and in the middle, can I put that right? So after having mapped those archaeologies, compared them to the contemporary city today and found that a lot of those spaces still exist with no marker of that history. And then mapping that in comparison to the city-owned parcels that are up for redevelopment started to suggest a strategy or sort of a strategic plan for a constellation of sites of memory that this expanded memorial could expand to include. So this is a plan view of that archaeology of the slave industry overlaid onto the contemporary city. And you see a lot of the spaces where people were sold and housed and warehoused still exist as open spaces today. And so in relationship to that, these were 8 concrete proposals that were submitted to the city for inclusion into their city development plan. So memory became part of the exercise of city building. And so these are some renderings from the different projects that we proposed. And what you see here is a range of different typologies, scales, emotions, speaking to that complexity of everyday memory. And so, you know, I think that in Charlottesville, this could actually go a step further. You know, I could see forming a land trust or a development authority after having mapped these archaeologies and linking the design of landscape of memory to a larger real estate development strategy. Again, linking back to this history of city building within the past. And this could expand regionally. I mean, this is a mapping of the landscape of Civil War commemoration, and Charlottesville is right in the thick of it. So there are scales of influence that are suggested here. Number 2 is leverage everything. The city of Charlottesville is in the midst of an urban renaissance. So major investments are taking place in infrastructure, institutions, urban development everywhere. So I propose to you to leverage everything. If something is getting built anyways, how is it speaking to memory? I don't care if it's a wall, a bench, a sewer system, a lighting fixture. Everything constructed can be performative in this way. And it's up to us as designers to figure out how. So a project I worked on in Houston in a neighborhood called Freedmanstown, which we talked about last night, the shotgun architecture links back all the way to architectural typology in West Africa, in the Yoruba tradition. So I was working for a small firm at the time that was contracted to just do the streetscape of the street. So to the left you see a historic fabric, to the right you see a school, and just like Walter mentioned last night, they wanted a fence around the school, and they wanted a wall. They wanted to upgrade the fence to a wall. And so we gave them a wall. Here's your wall. Oh, you want seating? You want benches? Okay, well here are your benches. We're gonna use that to talk about the history of the place. You need lighting? Here's your lighting. Talking about animating and telling the story of the place. And then third is to design generatively. There's this tendency to react or to invert or to co-opt the traditional memorial form. Like, let's design something taller than the Confederate monument, or let's put another monument with a black person on a horse, But these are demonstrations of power that are specific to European history. And so my third proposal is to generate new traditions, employ a language of power that is specific to people. So, for instance, in some of the projects that I'm working in, I've been collecting knowledge of plants used to demonstrate power in African and African American traditions. So how can ethnobotany birth new languages of memorial design? And if you look at Charlottesville, over 300 million years, it actually almost touches West Africa. So there is something about the ethnobotany of the soil that's generative. It's fertile, literally, figuratively. And it kind of speaks to that, I think there's something suggestive also about that sisterhood again with West Africa that I think could be a potential as a design departure. And then so the memorial is a concept that needs innovating. And maybe that's counterintuitive because memory is about the past, but we need to design it anew. And so I think moving forward, that's central to Charlottesville, and I propose we go back and get it. Thank you.
I only have 5 slides. I can just have 5. Hey, everybody. How many of you are actually from the community not really affiliated with UVA? I know we have several people raise hands. Okay, quite a few. That's great to see. How many of you are students? How many of you got students? I mostly wrote this for students, but or thought about this in terms of students. But I think we're all students in some way too. I'm going to actually not speak when I go through this slideshow, but I am going to preface this first. First of all, that was brilliant. Thank you for doing that. Those images are so powerful, and I'm looking at John Mason, John and Rachel, who served on the Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Memorials, and Public Spaces. Just to out them in case you've got time to stay after this and chat, but I know the photography that you've shown some of that photography before too. For the students in particular, I've heard that some people are being told by faculty at other schools not to come to Charlottesville, not to come to the University of Virginia. I think that is so wrong. I think it's such an exciting place to be right now. I would rather be here than any other place. I think that we had fissures that have been here for generations and generations that were revealed. And so we're finally dealing with those fissures, and that's exciting to have the opportunity to do that. It's painful. We don't really know how to do that. We often don't have the vocabulary to talk about race in particular, but we're doing it. And so I'm really glad to see the students here, and I'm encouraging people that I know that are interested in coming here to come here. This school's a vibrant, exciting, place is not afraid, faculty or students are not afraid to take a look at these questions. When I remember, and I forget too often, I also always start by acknowledging who's been here before. So every space in this country, like other countries, has been a contested space. The Monicans were here before, and exciting that they finally achieved federal recognition, which was something that was a couple generations, and that's another story that needs to be told about why heritage, the sort of administrative genocide that we have here. I think also the enslaved people that built this university, not this building, but built the university, and the people that maintain this, that many of them aren't paid a living wage. I think that needs to be acknowledged for us in the space that we are able to enjoy, that we benefit from the work of others, that some who had no choice in that work. I'm going to end with a question. It's not the question that's in here, but I'm actually not going to say anything. So if you could be able to look at this, could you go to the next slide?
Yes.
So my idea is, to all of you, what questions do you need to ask that will make this invisible history visible? To people who want to see it but can't see it because we don't know it, to people who don't want to see it but need to see it, and to all of us who really need to see it. So I'm looking forward to our discussion and be able to approach that question. Thanks.
I came to UVA in 1989 as an undergraduate student here at the School of Architecture. I lived in a dorm which is now torn down just beyond here by the stadium, never knowing that on the edge of it was the plantation. I found that out about 3 weeks ago. I went to the dining hall, what I call seniors hour, where I'd show up at 5 o'clock because I didn't want to sit in the racial separation of space. Black students sat in one area, white students sat in another. Travel after that really quick meal back to the School of Architecture to sit at my studio desk, passing the black student bus stop, and heading through the grounds of UVA. Heading through those grounds always felt like there were ghosts. Yesterday you spoke about ghosts, and it really touched me because I always wondered who was here before, but never realized in education there was never a moment to talk about this history and story. But I do remember being in Lynn Steer's survey class in architectural history and being asked to stop asking questions about the flat land in front of Monticello by the tour guide. Very forcefully. So in that space, and thinking about the past, I asked my parents for lots of questions. My parents had friends who were killed in the Orangeburg Massacre. And in that massacre, just imagine that your own student body is being eradicated by the actual police. What does that feel like? Next slide, please. Cue now, back here at UVA, or after returning in 2016, right before the election, and realizing that there's an opportunity. There's an existing system of delivery. This is the existing UVA walking tour that's been put together by the President's Commission on Slavery. An existing walking tour you can pick up in the Rotunda in an exhibition that talks about the Folsom history. You can walk around the sites, the grounds, and learn about the enslaved African Americans at UVA. Perhaps there's another way to look at the landscape and think about materials. Loving this idea of slate, thinking about the tops of the pavilions, this idea of combining it with the Blue Ridge, and actually thinking about the bodies and the builders in this space. What did it take to put UVA together? Who built UVA? Who's in this space? Strangely, I feel connected. Wait, the ghosts become real. I'm working with an amazing student team, Mion's in the room, of putting this idea together and thinking about new ways to design, think, and think for the future. This exhibition will be part of the bicentennial in the Rotunda in the West Oval Room this October. Next slide. So part of that returning is to design the class I wish I had. And in that class is to think about a way to get this to happen. A bunch of UVA students sitting in a black church in the center of Virginia in New Canton. Why are we sitting here? Because we're looking at Dr. Carter G. Woodson's birth site. The idea of analyzing the website, the site, the birth site itself, thinking about everything from creating a website to conceptual designs that are going through the National Park Service, working with the Carter G. Woodson Institute and the Buckingham African American Historical Society. This is actually the site here. All the slate for UVA comes from these spots here in Argonia, also Smithsonian, down to the James, up to the Ravenna River. You can take this existing tour now. It'll take you 2 days to go along the Civil Rights and Education Heritage Trail. Yet this site is not found on Google Maps. Students are working at the site and with the community specifically to think about design thinking on that site and in this space. This becomes a new environment that's based on the idea of empathy, using empathic design ideas to connect, work together, and think about humanity and also in respect to African American history. Next. That expands to a project that's supported by the flash funding right after August the 12th by the University of New Vinegar Hill. Students in design thinking are creating moments, this is at a Black Panther showing, to get feedback from the community based on an idea and concept that's come from African American community leaders. The idea of an African American led redevelopment area in the city, but also connecting with the Jefferson School, where students come up with concepts of how to survey. No one wants to see someone coming up to you with a survey clipboard. And thinking differently about what those methods could be. This is tested and it's been working quite efficiently and getting feedback that's going back to City Council and also the African American leaders who've just set up a brand new CDC for the city for investment. Next, please. So I leave you with this. I'm obsessed with the Spiral Group. They're a group of artists, African American artists, from 1963 to 1965. They met because they were trying to figure out how to get to the March on Washington efficiently. But within that space, they were thinking about a way to represent culture in form. That's the work of Mayor Bearden, Norman Lewis, and also Hale Woodruff. This idea of coming together, thinking about a way to be, thinking about a way to operate within the concept of a spiral. All the members become these numbers. This idea that the spiral always expands, but it's always going upward. It's full of optimization. It's full of optimism. It thinks about a way to construct and become a movement which can make change. I feel like we're in this period now, let's say we're about here, and we're trying to evolve our spiral. It's time to galvanize. It's time to organize. It's time to act as if we are doing our own civil rights movement, spatial justice, as Liz Oglu says. Thank you. So just a moment of reflection from us. Comments.
I don't think everybody knows who Carter G. Woodson was.
No worries. Carter G. Woodson, father of Black history, teacher, prophet, let's say, right? And leader of the importance of Black history and education, wrote the Miseducation of Indian Rose.
Well, one thing I was just randomly thinking about is I'm just going off of your spiral, and I guess it's somewhat of a coincidence that we both were thinking about a spiral, but I think maybe it's not a coincidence, maybe that we're talking about similar trajectories. And the questions that you bring up, Frank, I think are embedded within all of the things, all of the comments that we made. And I actually, in terms of just the way that you presented, the silence seemed appropriate as a way for us to all reflect on this question.
I have a question for you, Elgin, and actually, and you don't have to answer, of course, but so why'd you come back?
That's a great question that I got asked by every single person. And
I waited to ask you that.
But I'll be honest with you, I always had this feeling inside that I needed to give back and be in a place of service. And I think over time, I kept hearing the call and it got louder and louder. I think if you want to be part of the change, if you want change to happen, you have to show up. So I decided to show up. I didn't expect it was going to be this big. Hey, I'm here. And I say that because of such said movements, dynamic parents who pushed me through the busing system, knowing that you come from a place where people have dreamt of this moment we're having right now. So therefore you have to do your part, you have to do the work.
I almost threw out what I was going to say because there's, how many of you heard starting today, there's something called Listen First, the national movement that's in Charlottesville, and it's got some of my colleagues. I'm a mediator, facilitator, sort of on the edge of this sort of dialogue and deliberation group, and there's several people that are coming from that national movement that are coming here to quote unquote help Charlottesville listen first. And I was thinking of that, and I'm not a designer, but I know I hear from too many people in the community that say, designers among others will come in and say, here's what we think you need, right? Here's our vision for what we think you need to have happen. And I think that's what's happened with the dialogue and deliberation folks at Listen First. They didn't ask themselves that question, who do I need to listen to? Is this something that we really want to have here? So to me, it's the idea of before doing anything in a community, we need to be asking ourselves, what are the questions that we need to be asking? We can't even do that by ourselves. We need to go and find either the people in the community or connection to the community that can help us ask those questions too. And so I almost threw that out because it bothers me that my colleagues are here today and tomorrow thinking that they're doing something that our community needs without being grounded in the community, without having gone to the people who are working to make justice first, our movement. And Listen First is it's a good thing in a relationship of equals. I think it's a really good thing. I think it's a good advice if you are a group of people coming into an outside community to listen first. In the community of unequals, in the community where we have such a strong history and legacy and continuation of racial injustice, I think justice first is a much better idea. I think human rights first is a much better idea. And I think asking questions first, is a right idea too. So I actually did take more time to speak. So it wasn't all silent, but I felt that was connected. So I didn't throw it out after all.
Okay.
I wonder if people can just scooch a little closer so the corner can stand across the
That's powerful.
Talk show.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be here. To build on Frank's comment, I had this tension of, wow, I'm coming from Detroit, right? With a community with very different needs, and how to start to unpack this conversation of where are things common and where are things different. I wanted to start with a part of history that I don't think we talk about at all, really, which is really the Reconstruction phase. What happened? It was this blip. It didn't happen. It was a failure. But I think, really thinking about the hard work that we need to do in this question of happening here, happening across the country. what are our values and who do we want to be as Americans, I think is this really critical moment that we're in right now, and it's worth really unpacking what that means, what we do about it, and what needs to happen to create the values that I think a lot of us think about. But thinking about the first people who did kind of courageously get out there and work to push that goal, and started looking at a lot of the imagery of the 1860s, but how were people even thinking about this issue then of, I think Walter talked about freed and this idea of freedom, but how do we think about this idea of equal justice, of civil rights, of how that impacts not only our current built environment, housing, schooling, representation. I think it really touches all these pieces, and this kind of connection has never really been completed. We kind of gave up in a number of ways. This idea of the Freedmen's Bureau kind of standing between the masses. I think, as the politics of the 1870s turned, the North kind of abandoned it, the South kind of abandoned it, and, kind of the Captain America got a flag on his head in the middle. That concept we really gave up on. How do we actually create the platform for people to have equal opportunity before the law in this country? And I think, in thinking about and looking at how even somewhere like Vinegar Hill is talked about today, I really want to caution us to not be too nostalgic about the parts of this community that worked, and the fact that I think a large reason people at the time could even make the case for demolishing Vinegar Hill was it was also systematically denied critical infrastructure to function as a healthy neighborhood. There's no curbs, there's no sewers, right? Like, these were other structural racist systems that led to Vinegar Hill being what and where it was, even before the conversation of urban renewal and the destruction of the community came up. And I think it's important for us as professionals in the built environment to be incredibly clear and clear-eyed about that history, and not to kind of nostalgize kind of some of those other systematic problems out of the way. So I think, I think we talked a little bit about why it's really hard to have a lot of these conversations, and I think it's hard to talk about stuff that is traumatic. I think there's lots of layers of how this trauma has existed on an individual level, on a community level, on a societal level. And I think I'd encourage everyone to actually grab it. I think we tend to make that one of those things that we do push away and stuff it, and I'm gonna move really fast and get to solutions and not deal with it. But the actual process, I think, of thinking about what happened, of thinking about mourning, of thinking, do we think about the statues and these monuments as, are they memorials to Reconstruction, right? Like, is this something that we start to think about in a different way? Can we start to think collectively about how do we mourn, how do we talk about these things? And really start to think about some of those tools. I think as designers, what we have a platform for creating is really, especially in thinking about how do you create a public space with people, it really gives you a platform to start to unpack some of these issues. So not only how can you help to create and set the grounds for a good process to enable that conversation to occur, but also can your process help people process and get you to a place where you can get those actual connections to actually hear people, to build that empathy, to get you then to what is the form, what are the design solutions. I don't know that you can get there without the hard work, is my experience with it. I do think there's a really important opportunity here to have that conversation, given some of the more recent events that have taken place. I was looking at some of the plans that were sent around, and this is for the strategic investment area, I think, that's looking just south of downtown, where Friendship Court is, where public housing is, and I'm really struck by the idea of like, oh, we're gonna move people in public housing again, right? Like, how do we actually, if we take these values, think about how do they play out, to Sarah's point, everywhere, right? Like, this isn't just what do we do in the parks, what do we do here, but how do we think about this platform of spatial justice everywhere? How do we get to a point where it's totally banal and second nature to have Black bodies in a landscape in a community where there are Black bodies? How do we have this just be boring? Is I guess really what my vision would be. And I think the other opportunity here at UVA, how could UVA actually take on what Thomas Jefferson was as an incredibly complicated individual who I think embodies a lot of the contradictions around racism, around justice, around the story that we tell ourselves about America. I think that sometimes happens in the art school, in the architecture school, but like what if this was heart and soul of what UVA as an entire institution could become about and really start to own as a story, to unpack even just what happens and how this institution talks about itself and its history. Thank you.
Thanks. This is the advanced issue. Kofi, Boone, I have no ties to UVA, so I use that as creative license to do something a little different. So when I told my mother that I was coming to UVA to participate in this, in response to Charlottesville, she asked two really pointed questions. She asked, well, what have they done since then to protect people? And how have the people who were responsible for the act, how have they atoned for what they've done? So when we get into the discussion, this is a pointed pushback against empathy. Because in a lot of ways, the recurring trauma with extended periods of no justice or delayed justice exacerbates it. So what I did instead of focusing on the past is I'm a big fan of comic books, and I'm a big fan of science fiction. So this is a comic book science fiction story of Charlottesville. All right, 1720, whenever she faced trauma, she put her hands in the dirt. 1820, whenever she faced trauma, she put her hands in the dirt. 1920, whenever she faced trauma, she put her hands in the dirt. 2020, whenever she faced trauma, the dirt fought back. Miraculously, this resident of Charlottesville discovers she has a superpower. And that superpower is whenever something horrible happens that's racially motivated, the landscape grabs and swallows the offender immediately. There's no cops, there's no Justice Department, there's no nothing. They try and reenact that horrible incident that happened downtown. Somebody even actually tries to drive a car down the street to mow it down. And miraculously, the street transforms and blocks the car and locks up everybody in the street that's trying to protest. This poor guy in the front is reacting because he's trying to get to the store that's over here in the corner. He can't get to it because until they apologize and they stop, that wall stays up. It just appeared out of thin air. So whenever they came from the street fought back. So where do they go? And this comes from a conversation I had with Michael Sorkin. Michael Sorkin came to North Carolina to do guest reviews in my studio 10 years ago, and he sees the Confederate monument on our state capitol grounds, and he's like, look, we should sneak out in the middle of the night and we should bomb that thing. And I was like, I'm not ashamed of you yet, can't do it. I can handle it. But what he talks about is the old Greek city-state motto, the agora and the nix. So the agora was intentionally placed near the place of governance. It's the idea that your governance decisions are based on moving through this open market area every day, tasting different foods, hearing different languages, negotiating difference, and that indirect learning would inform your governance, essentially make you more tolerant, unless you were a slave. We had a whole debate about this in terms of, at any given time, like in Athens, about half the population of Athens were slaves. But that being said, but half people that were free. The Nix was different though. So the Nix was a place where you could publicly proclaim your issue, right? And people had to listen to you. So we got a lot of agoras. We ain't got no Nixes. So what if the campus became the Nix? And that people from Charlottesville could use the lawn to air their grievances and atone. So those people who tried to murder all those people on that street get magically transported to these boxes. In the future, it becomes a religion. So people start to worship these boxes where these offenders are locked up. And the whole time they're meditating and they're going, atone, 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 atone. And family members have to come and speak on behalf of who these people are. the people inside have to talk about what they're into. This poor guy was getting ready to get jumped on by a cop. That thing grabbed that cop before it could even touch that guy and locked him up in that box. Praise the Lord. Until they admitted their wrongs, the campus fought back. And our last stop, Emancipation Park. Once you have atoned, what they discovered was when they took the Robert E. Lee statue off of its pedestal and put it on the ground to human scale, that it opened up a gate. And once you atone on campus, pop out of the statue. Free person. Now, it doesn't always work, right? So this poor lady's sitting here, her friend is on the cell phone, she's trying to watch, she's telling her friend that, hey, he hasn't repented yet. We're waiting for him to come out, he's not coming out. There are protests. Well, people have a right to be racist. This person is complaining that the measures are too extreme. There hasn't been a racially motivated attack or outbreak in Charlottesville for a long time, but it seems too extreme. This person is like, you're crazy. You know? So, and if they atone, the park set them free. So the whole moral of the story is that we rely on the tolerance of good people to encourage positive actions and activities. And it puts out there the harm in that delayed response and reaction, and the potential of immediate responses, and the light that can come around it. So, thank you.
So I moved to Charlottesville from Florence, Italy on July 11, 1994. As you can see here, I may as well have been an alien. On our first walk from downtown through Ridge Street, where we would eventually live, I asked, where are all the people and why are there so many trees? I was 9, so you can forgive my bluntness, but before long, this abundance of living landscape began to define my sense of Charlottesville as home, as a place of growth, safety, and wonder. Its power in shaping my own experience of this place is in large part why I'm sitting here today. This was true of the quiet hills and the horizon and the dappled light on the downtown mall. And it was especially potent in our yard at 702 Ridge Street. 3 100-year-old oak trees branched over my brothers and my expeditions. Stands of bamboo held entire flocks of birds. The vegetable garden, under first my grandmother's and then my care, yielded with exuberance. As I claimed this entirely foreign landscape as my own, as I projected my own narratives onto it, it helped me feel like I belonged, like I was home. This is perhaps why I could walk by the Lee statue many, many afternoons on the way to the library and not feel its burden. Or why I could wonder why my neighbors, who were all black on Ridge Street, I never saw them strolling on the downtown mall. This is why I could refer to this house as the ancestral manse, kind of jokingly, but I did, even though there was nothing of my own ancestors in that soil. I later realized that this sense of belonging in Charlottesville, and if you're black, basically anywhere else in America, is a deep privilege. Because home is political. The right to put down roots, to feel one's ancestors in the yard, that is tantamount to the right to self-determination. And the removal of that right is a means for rupturing communities, breaking ties to people, culture, and land. So more than 50 years earlier, the same house was the first on the Ridge bought by local civil rights leader George Ferguson. As a result, that same yard had been the site of a burning cross. When I looked out at those oak trees at the time, I knew nothing of strange fruit. And it now strikes me that those trees outlasted an entire neighborhood, Vinegar Hill, by decades. In many ways, forced removal from home is the story of being black in America. It's a cycle of displacement and resilience, of continuously making and losing your home. From the Middle Passage to redlining and urban renewal to Hurricane Katrina and gentrification today. It's a cycle designed to further white supremacy and solidify racial control. There's a reason why the mere notion of 40 acres and a mule sparked systematic white terrorism during the Reconstruction, or why Lee's statue was placed on the edge of thriving Vinegar Hill. Self-determination is power, and home is contested. Today, Charlottesville is still home. It's all of our home in some way or another. Despite its many charms, the city's income disparity is the largest in the state of Virginia. And I would say if we're not careful, its buoyant growth will come at the cost of new forms of displacement, which disproportionately will affect Black residents. August 12, 2017 is a room in our home. So the ground in the yard is freshly poisoned, but we must break into it, turn it over, let it breathe. We must work it to health. In his book, Cotton Kingdom, Olmsted's observations about pre-Civil War life in Virginia are inseparable from its landscape. They're embedded in it, the swaths of scruffy pine forests, the throws of tobacco and maize, the hilltop plantations. These all spoke volumes about power, economy, and the degradation of slavery. Olmsted's reading of society was one with his reading of landscape. Landscape was the Greek chorus in many ways. Our crisis as a society today is embodied in public space that systematically excludes, that still treats certain bodies as less deserving, less safe, and less human. And here's, a picture of the downtown mall, which I think is very telling in many ways, on a thriving day. And then of 812 on the right. Lee Park was an extreme instance of such exclusion and how clearly it symbolized the doctrine of white supremacy. But the message of public spaces discerned for certain publics is subtle and pervasive. So if we're to counter the message in a future Charlottesville, how can we once again give landscape a speaking role? I think that's a question that we can all ask ourselves. How can we acknowledge that it's not neutral? And how can we use it to not only embody a more expansive cultural memory, but to support a more just way of living? So as I've been reflecting on these questions, I find myself going back to home lost. And I was looking at the yards of Vinegar Hill, and it's interesting, Alexa, I mean, not as spaces that were perfect or that were even healthy in structural ways, but as places that people loved. Just like I loved my own home and I felt like I belonged there. So what stories do the people who lived here tell about these places? Those two boys at the top, how they're comfortable playing their little game of dice or whatever, marbles. How did these places foster everyday belonging? What were the trees kids gathered under in August, the vegetables planted by grandmothers in the backyard? How did these landscapes live and work? These landscapes are by no means an answer, but they are a narrative source. They can teach us powerful lessons too about scale, about comfort, about neighborliness, about street life. You can actually say, in some ways, the very concept of private property is challenged here. You see there's no curb, but that I think says something about street life and about sort of living close to your neighbor in a way. These were places as much imbued with social use, woven through with their own personal myths, as they are now landscapes of loss. They recall and celebrate the quotidian reality of these people. And in dramatic opposition to memorial as object, these spaces give us clues about memory in Charlottesville as the realm of everyday belonging. So, and I think this is the future, this is the goal of this future landscape, to frame us all as equally and legitimately belonging in Charlottesville, in its spaces, in its narratives, and its many legacies. And I will say, looking around this room, I have some questions about who belongs in this room. And I think we all ought to ask ourselves that, because it's every space, right, that we need to be questioning. Because what is Black landscape in Charlottesville? It's all landscape in Charlottesville. What are Black spaces? It's all Black, it's all space. And just like, those yards were the sort of continuous collective fabric of home, this future landscape is a network. It's an evolving scaffolding both for memory and for living. Unlike a static object memorial, like Sara was saying, landscape pulses. And its power lies in that capacity to both kind of conjure the past, bear witness to the present, but also to absorb new narratives of belonging as they arise. As Walter said yesterday, memory becomes embedded and placed through living. So a sustainable landscape of memory in Charlottesville will pulse with conversation, reflection, and just being. It will recognize and uphold the humanity of those moving through it and inhabiting it. And honestly, design matters, but design is not enough. If we, as landscape architects, as designers, whatever, want to shape a new future for Charlottesville, we must step outside of the safety of our discipline. Access to affordable housing is not only a design issue, it's a policy issue. The question of who calls Charlottesville home, who feels like they belong, is not only a design issue, it's a policy issue. Ultimately, these policies express themselves in spatial form, but radical design often happens far before capital D designers are involved. So I would say step out of the studio, organize, run for office, seize power. Through new landscape narratives, new landscape spaces, and a new body politic, then we can really begin to challenge the ideologies that are inscribed in Charlottesville's very topography. If Monticello will always sit on top of that hill, the true question is how can we turn it upside down?
Discussion in block 2.
I'm really taken with this idea that came up in a couple of different ways, Kofi. I think with your point about atonement and sort of if we are to actually try and set the table for everyone to have the same voice, it's not like, hey, here are the chairs, we're all ready to go. You know, I've been thinking a lot about what is that other work that needs to happen that's actually different, right? And different on both sides to be able to get to that point of, you know, being equals at the table. And sort of what does that mean? I think we often like to skip and just be like, well, we offered you a seat, end of story. But you know, how does that process work? What are the different roles that we need to think about and play, and how do we need to actually invest in human capital, in physical capital to make that possible?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I really, when you, Alexa, were saying that it's actually, in some ways, this like, we're just future is just boring. That was really something that spoke to me. It shouldn't be noticeable, right? Like, in some ways. So it's an interesting, because the process to get to it is so deliberate. It has to be deliberate. Like, it's not going to happen by itself. Like, we can't expect it to just, you know, the arc of the universe bends toward justice. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's much more complicated. It's like a spiral, right? But so the process will be, I think, will require so much work, and then in some ways the end is like very boring. It's kind of interesting, and it's interesting also that you frame the process as this like mythical sci-fi kind of like clash.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think Black people have done enough work. I don't think Black people have to say anything else about this. I think a lot of this is not our problem. We have to endure it. But I would say this in terms of this question, and it was in a conversation I was having with some board members of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, and we were trying to make sense of, you know, really horrible terms like diversity and inclusion and equity, right? So here's an analogy. So diversity is you get invited to the dance. Inclusion is you get to the dance and someone invites you to dance with them. Equity is, why are we dancing? And I think that implicit in a lot of how we frame these relationships, it's the assumption that the structure that exists is accommodating of all. And that question before that question of, well, what are alternative structures or other ways? Where do people who currently have power are in a position where they have to share? They have to take a step back. And they have to be open to enabling others to make decisions for them. When does that table turn? And I think that that's the challenge. And I think in design in particular, that's the challenge, because the canon by which we are taught to think about design, the tools that we use, the processes, in many ways are seen as value neutral, objective, and deal with this notion of the universal human needs. And there's a fear of the postmodern, which is saying that there really isn't a universal, because if you don't have standards, then what do we got? We got chaos. But I think that there's another way of looking at it. And I think it's power. And so that's kind of what I look at now, is power first. Like, who's making decisions? The people in power, where have they been in a situation where they had to take a step back and allow others to do anything? And I feel like that's sort of the path that needs to be explored.
I just want to underscore something that you said that really spoke to me just now, because,
oh, yes. I just want to underscore something that you said just now that really spoke to me, because I do feel like there's this tension sometimes. Some people want to slow things down and process, but like I personally, there's so much to do. Like, we're behind, like we gotta go, you know?
I'm Amber Wiley. I'm an assistant professor of American Studies at Skidmore College. I'm also the associate director of the Intergroup Relations Program, which is a social justice program. It's a minor at the college that is based on dialogue and dialoguing between different groups. More people need to do it. More people at the college need to do it. I came to the University of Virginia in 2003, straight from undergrad. I came here because the University of Virginia School of Architecture has an architectural history program, like their own department, which was crazy. And I intended to get my PhD here. But I left after 2 years. I couldn't do it, quite frankly. I couldn't do Charlottesville. And so it's funny that people are like, Charlottesville, I can't believe. And I'm like, really? You didn't feel it? Like, I felt it all the time. So Frank, well, I'll get to the past, and this is part of the past. What brought me to the University of Virginia, besides the fact that they had an architectural history department with people who specialize in all these different points of architectural history, was that the idea that I could study the UNESCO World Heritage Site was like amazing to me. In the U.S., we don't have as many as, say, Italy, right? Not as much World Heritage. So the fact that it was a university and a site, and that people lived on the lawn, like all of these things. So it was the past and the present. So this is my past image of UVA, is coming for the architectural history department, coming to study and live every day as part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, and really thinking about how important and special that is. Like that really drew me in. So I arrived on campus. Back then, there was the Common Course, which I understand is no longer offered here at UVA, which is when all 4 of the departments get together. And then it was design, planning, landscape, and history, and they all took the course together. Washington, D.C. was actually our case study that year. And so the first day that the Common Course met, I sat in the room that we were in last night, and I was waiting for the other Black people to arrive, because I knew I was just sitting there waiting. And people trickled in, and I was waiting. And then class started, and I said, well, maybe they're late. We can be late, we're just late, little sister size. And they never came in, and it was just me. I was the only incoming Black student across all the departments in the graduate school at that time, that year. And I was like, nobody told me. I wish somebody would have told me. I would have negotiated my scholarship much better. From the beginning, then I had a very different kind of view, and I was like, this isn't right, this is weird. And so many of the things that came up in Frank's discussion, and also Elgin's, are things that hit home to me, referring to the University of Virginia as a plantation, because we did. Black students most certainly did. You're like, you don't do the plantation today? You don't be on campus. The Black bus stop, right? That was the place where Black kids hung out. We hung out. You could always see somebody, give them dap, walk through. And actually Rashida just walked in, so I'm putting you on the spot. She was one of the few Black undergraduate students at the University of Virginia when I was there. So I found solace in reaching out and bonding with the undergrads, because I was like, this is wild. So I came with this wonderful notion of the gorgeous lawn. The lawn is gorgeous. But I do have a troubled kind of past history with UVA because of what I experienced there. Oops, I hit the wrong button. That button. Okay. I'd like to just have a moment of silence. I wasn't sure if I was going to put this image up because I'll say what it is first and then have a moment of silence. But I Googled the word Charlottesville. Just put it in Google. No modifiers. Not Charlottesville riot. Not Charlottesville unite the right. Not the word Charlottesville. I Googled it and then I just clicked images. And so these are the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows of images that pop up when you Google the word Charlottesville. This is present. This is in like last week, present. I imagine in 2003 when I first got here, if you Googled the word Charlottesville, you get UNESCO World Heritage Site, you get the Line, you get the mall, you get Monticello. Well, this is actually the image of Charlottesville today. It's not the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And because this collection includes an image of the violence that was perpetrated against people's bodies and that the loss of life that we had, and I'd like to just take a couple of seconds of silence to acknowledge that life was lost in this conversation, in this struggle. So. Thank you. And it's not just for Heather Heyer. It's for our ancestors. It's for our folks who toiled in the land and the soil, who built the buildings, who suffered under the lash while serving the University of Virginia, enslaved peoples. It's real. This is the present. This is also the present. I read in a book by Carl Abbott, it's called Political Terrain. It's about Washington, D.C. And he talks about D.C. as this mediating kind of space between the North and the South. He was trying to place D.C. in a geographic region. And he was like, it's not quite the North, it's not quite the South. That's part of the reason why they chose it. And he talks about the potential for, the various narratives that can occur, the energies that happen in places that are always on an edge, a regional edge. And so he's talking about Washington, D.C. in that manner. And I remember when I read it and spent some time in New Orleans, I thought about, New Orleans is the northernmost Caribbean city that people say, right? And it came to my mind that way. It's like there's so many different stories that people want to be telling. And so Carl Abbott talks about Washington, D.C. as a place of liminality. Because there are so many forces and things that are happening. And thinking about the fact that presently we're in a liminal space here in Charlottesville. There was the past, there's the future, but in our present moment, we're in a liminal space where there was a particular identity that Charlottesville held, that the University of Virginia held for itself. And it's experienced in the most, tragic kind of violent way, this separation from that identity. And so now it's gotten to the point where this is where we are here. We're trying to build this here, this communitas, because we're broken apart, and literally, if you think about it in terms of architecture too, you had the structure, the identity that was all, kind of firm, it felt firm. We've broken across that space, and a little bit of deconstruction now is what we need to go through. I'm a part of a sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And one of the things that they said during the pledge process, which I hated at the time, but okay, I get it. It's like, we break you down to build you up. And I'm like, right? But in the process of breaking down, right, there is this kind of formation of communitas. and then you return from that space. I actually showed this image to some of my students a couple weeks ago, and one of them was like, so if we do go through this whole thing, and this is the image I found on the interwebs, if we go through this thing and we return, does our identity have to then be a part of the structure again? And I was like, ooh, I don't know, because she wasn't really feeling that idea. And I was like, I get why you don't feel that. Is it this newly formed identity? Does it have to become a part of the structure? And I said, would you rather it not? And she didn't know. She didn't know how she felt about it. I still don't know, because it was a great question. I kept coming back to it. Because part of her wanted to just be anti-structure all the time. And I guess I'll, kind of leave that up to you all in thinking about, do we even want to be a part of the structure? The future, I don't design like I used to. I mainly write histories. And I thought about different ways that we can talk about process, and was like, we have no process. Part of me thought, maybe an additive process. We would just add all the, I think Walter said it. So who built that? Who built that? Who built that? What was that? Who did? I'm like, yeah, everywhere. When I was in New Orleans, I'm like, everything that slavery touched, it needs a plaque. Slaves entered here. Slaves were held here. Slave money helped build this bank. Everywhere. So people would be like, okay, we get it. But then I thought then it would be, people would react kind of harshly to it. And so I thought, well, maybe if we had an integrative approach, which isn't just adding to what is there, but really does work with, add on, and dialogue with what is already here. So I don't have the images of future projects and things we might do in that sense, but I'll talk a little bit about policy, because we did mention policy. And yes, we're tired of diversity and inclusion initiatives. I've sat on all the committees to sit on at Tulane, at Skidmore. I've sat here at University of Virginia, I sat on them, and I think Kofi's discussion of diversity is, just inviting you to the party is exactly right. Inclusion is asking you to dance, and, equity is having the opportunity to actually say, why are we here? But it's not always even the best framework. I propose thinking about, and even now we're even tired of social justice in a sense. People call them social justice warriors. But truly thinking about design, social justice, and policy, and how these things all come together. Yeah, not just the who's in the room, but how do they get there? So at Virginia, when I was here, I met with the dean. I said, I was like the only black person that came in. Like, did y'all track that? Did someone, is there someone watching the numbers? Like, are y'all, at the time, they're like, we weren't really aware. And I was like, really? One of the things that I hoped would have happened was, like a recruitment strategy. We've got Hampton, we've got Tuskegee, we've got FAMU, we have Howard. These are HBCUs that have design programs. Why aren't y'all doing recruitment with them? And actually the big thing was the addition. Why aren't we giving students more money to come to this school? Who was I talking to? Leia. It's like, you go into landscape to be poor, right? You get all these loans in your master's, and it's like, what student of color is gonna come to get a lot of debt? Like, it doesn't make sense. Like I said, I am still paying my debt from the University of Virginia. I graduated 13 years ago. So it's public service loan forgiveness. It's just that we have to deal with. We have to ask ourselves these questions. And finally, thinking about decolonization as another particular kind of strategy that we can use in the stories that we tell ourselves about the places where we live and our curriculum. I think that you all have hit on a lot of this kind of process of decolonizing the narrative of architecture, decolonizing the narrative of landscape. I never thought about landscape the way that you all think about landscape, and it has already opened up some new frameworks for my understanding of what that is and things that I can tell my students. In Elgin's discussion, I'm sorry, I think it's over 5 minutes, so I apologize. Elgin, the why did you come back question, I was a disgruntled student in undergrad. And I have all the questions of like, well, why aren't we talking about the people? Like, I don't care. Like the Corbusier, like I love the shapes. We talked about the shapes are gorgeous, yes, but do the people actually like where they were living? And like, why don't we talk about the people who lived in Cabrini Greens who then had to suffer from the design that was translated from Europe that wasn't even fit for the climate? Like, can we really talk about these other things instead of just the greater narrative? Part of it is the recruitment strategy, part of it is changing the curriculum, and the fact that you're coming in and doing exactly what I thought about. I want to teach the classes I wish I could have taken. And we're few and far in between. Kofi too, we're few and far in between. So thinking about how strategies for recruitment and retention play into so many of these frameworks that we would like to talk about. But it's more than just a numbers game. It's a curricular change, it's a strategic planning change. I looked at the UVA strategic plan, I was not impressed. I looked at the master plan for the campus, how often is that updated? Because the last one was 2008. Anybody have any? Yeah, so talk about as outdated is true. It was 2008 was the last time the master plan. So y'all need to go back and look at the master plan so that we can have a master plan on campus that talks about these issues and a strategic plan for the university that looks at these issues and deals with them directly instead of everything that happens at Charlottesville or UVA is being reactionary. Like it needs to be embedded in the language of what people say they want to do. So that you can always hold the university accountable. It's like, well, you said you were going to do it. You know, I thought, well, maybe whatever we're talking about here fits under pillar 2, right, of this UVA strategic plan. But I was trying to find a place in the language where we can say, well, you all said you want to do it, you know, and to foster intellectual curiosity, so on and so forth. We need to truly put this in the language of what UVA stands for, what the architecture school stands for, how the architect of the campus understands their role, like it needs to be there. So I'll just stop with that, but just thinking about it in all these different ways and really committing ourselves to it and putting the resources behind the words to get the thing done.
Thanks everyone for coming out in this good weather. I wouldn't be here. And I'm glad for the break from yesterday with the cold. I had a bunch of people asking me yesterday, don't you miss the beach? A question I've been getting quite a bit because I've been in Boston since September, which means I only had 2 weeks that wasn't winter. And my answer to that is no, I hate the beach. I absolutely hate the beach, as do so many Jamaicans. But I get asked the question all the time, and it's not a failure of knowledge so much as it's a failure of imagination. In other words, you live on an island, how could you not like the beach? But for so many other people, like me, on the island that the beach reminds them of, it's a bring of hurricanes, it's a bring of slave traders, it's a bring of pirates and buccaneers, which are not romanticized by us. They were also, bringing slaves. And it's a bring of cruise ships and tourists who exoticize us or condescend to us, who see us as sources of labor or leisure. Something to laugh at rather than laugh with. Or the beach again, is a place that brings the very wealthy or the wannabe wealthy Jamaicans who's really interested in privatizing it and having it as a playground. So when you grew up on an island in which outsiders come and think of it as a playground or a battleground, it's very hard to see the beach as something that you like. And so I want to talk about that today, to bring us up here so we think of imagination. Because in all the discussions we're having about memorials and Charlottesville and how to handle these legacies of slavery and memory, we keep thinking that what's really good at the bridge that we need to use to connect people is knowledge. But when somebody goes up to our distinguished lecturer yesterday, Walter Hood, and he gives a talk, and there's a reception for him, and they refuse to serve him wine because, he's an imposter. You couldn't have been the speaker. That wasn't a failure of knowledge. That was a failure of imagination. When they're trying to create structures, trying to deal with landscapes, we're not so much trying to communicate knowledge. We're not so much trying to reach people at the level of knowledge. We're trying to reach them at the level of imagination. When I came to Charlottesville, I felt that the motto for the city was, "Isn't it beautiful?" Because it was the thing everybody said. So, "Oh, I'm in Charlottesville." "Oh, Charlottesville, isn't it beautiful?" And if you're black, Charlottesville motto, "Isn't it beautiful?" can grate. That we're thinking about landscape and landscape architecture, but landscape has a persona, a scene. And I want to get us to a place in which people here who are planners, who are designers, who are architects, to start beginning to think, what does it mean to actually think of a landscape versus a scene? You're not trying to create scenes, you're trying to create landscapes. Landscape are persona. They have a language, they speak to you, you speak to them, you move through them, there's a relationship with them. This is a photograph by Salomon called Scarred Tree. And for so many people, that's what the landscape is. It's one that is scarred, it's one that has a story, it's one that has a history, multiple stories. So we're moving through places in which we're pretty much actually moving on fossil records. And what we're trying to do is trying to ask, what are the different layers there? How do we begin removing those fossil records? How do we begin seeing the different stories, the different contours inscribed beforehand? And how might something that we create, something that we build, be able to begin looking at the different fossil records? Begin to act the different stories that are there. And how might we do it in a way that allows various stories to bump into each other, allows stories to coexist, allow people to coexist? What does it mean to actually imagine the experiences people have gone through and are currently going through? In other words, what does it mean to think of design and architecture not merely as process? We're so focused on process. We have the Blue Ribbon Commission, and we're going to get to all these steps to create the kind of memorials, the kind of spaces that we want in Charlottesville. But what might it mean to think of architecture as an experience? What might it mean to think of it as a way of seeing? And I see a lot of students here, and I'm recognizing the questions that keep getting asked over and over from students these days is what I'd call defensive architecture. Not the type that they have in New York City now where they're trying to exclude the homeless by making it sharper, you can't sit nowhere. But a different kind of defensive architecture where we're so interested in how we're being seen, almost like we're trying to be the J. Alfred Proof rocks of architecture. We dare not eat a peach. We're so self-handpicked. But rather than that, what might it mean to start thinking of architecture as a way of seeing, of building experiences, of trying to invite people into an experience? Let's move to the home. And why? We're going back to Emerson, jotting in his journals, and he says, all things are engaged in writing their history. Not the footsteps into the snow or along the ground, but prints in characters more or less lasting, a map of its march. And here it is. The ground is all memoranda. Bears repeating, especially if you can't understand my accent. The ground is all memoranda and signatures, and every object covered over with hints. So what might it mean to think of that? What might it mean to build, to think of building and designing with that in mind? And we're taking out memorial, but I think that in many ways the most significant memorial activity we're involved in is the act of walking. Walking transforms something from a space into a place. Walking is how we have a sense of attachment, a sense of place, a sense of movement. Moving at this simple thing of 3 miles per hour, we have some Canadians here, 5 kilometers per hour. What might it mean to move through the world at that pace and to slow it down and to find ways of inscribing our imagination into the landscape, but also recognizing that the landscape itself inscribes itself onto our imagination. Back again to the thing of imagination. Let's go to the next one. So here's a Whitney plantation, for example, in Louisiana, in New Orleans, a place which I was banned from for a few years. because I kept harassing the people who kept giving these tours, and somehow slavery didn't happen. So eventually I got blacklisted, and seeing that not too many black people were on these tours, they knew when I was coming. They're like, no, you're right. But even to walk through, is to walk through and recognize, to see the trees the way Sally Mann has represented them. In a haunted South, in a trees that for some people it's, oh, isn't it beautiful? For some people it evokes lynching. For some people it evokes a gathering place where slaves would have a sense of community and family together. It evokes any number of things. And so we're thinking of landscapes, we're thinking of places in which we're trying to have people coexist and recognizing that there are different memories attached. There are different ways of seeing. And so as we're doing that, I want us to start considering what might it mean to start building with a deep consciousness of blind spots. Think of the idea of a blind spot. It's such a simple thing that you're moving along and something that is actually right there well within purview of your vision is hidden and lost to you. And often all it takes is a simple adjustment, a mere simple adjustment to acknowledge all these things that are right there, hidden in plain view, often because of something within you, failure to see. But also the nature of the blind spot is that if you keep moving on and ignoring it, it can cause any amount of pernicious damage to others, while you still move on in your own advantage or your own privilege of recognizing it. So what might it mean to then begin thinking of blind spots and then trying to act, what might it mean to imagine somebody else's experience, or imagine the variety of experiences somebody could get going through this. So after they refurbish and redid within the plantation, and I'm now invited back, they started moving other houses, other slave quarters into, within the plantation, and you get a sense of the limited, the meager, the confined, conditions in which people had to work and to live and to move and have their being. You saw it in relation to the big great house, and so suddenly you get a sense of the inequalities that happened. You get a sense of the asymmetry of life that happened with it. And so suddenly they started doing things which gave you, a sense, of history, in a richer sense of different memories that overlap. Mind you, I still have issues. I don't think they get it all right. There are these figures that I have of children that, in a way, leads a kind of romance or, a kind of, I'm at a loss of the right adjective, but suffuses it with, still a tinge of romanticism that, makes me bristle. But at least they're still trying to get some things right and recognizing that landscape as a person and recognizing that landscape is telling a story. And part of what you're doing in architecture, part of what you're doing in these memorials is not just remembering. It's not just an act of, memorials of seeing something and memorializing something, but also a way of seeing. A way of seeing and a way of actually accommodating multiple ways of seeing. But what does this mean, talking about imagination and recognizing the landscape as a persona? I recognize that when we think history and memory, too often memory, it feels like a backing into history. We're thinking of, for example, Vinegar Hill, and we're thinking of all the different memories, of Charlottesville, or we're even thinking of, August 12th, which now has a moniker, A12. But what about the memories that are often reenacted on a daily basis?
I'm serious, for safety.
What you're saying is that I've been trying to tell brothers, I've been trying to tell black men that every group of black men moving together needs to have one white guy together walking with them for safety.
Because when the shit goes down, somebody's gonna need to talk to the police. That's when that white friend comes in handy. Uh-oh, Ernie, you want to get this one? Come on now, come on now. Do something. So black people are very afraid of the police. That is a big part of our culture. No matter how rich you are, how old you are, we're just afraid of them. We got every reason to be afraid of them. You know what I mean? Like you're a white lady, you ever been pulled over before? Then what they say, let me see your driver's license and your registration, right? See, I'm just guessing. That's not what they say to us.
So we're here thinking about public space. And when we use the word public space, we're thinking of an equal shared space. But if we start interrogating memories, current memories, public space is not really public. Public space is not really a place of coexistence. If you start interrogating and imagining what it might mean to move in a particular memory through public space, for people unlike you, people who might be in your blind spot, people who are shoved in your blind spot, suddenly you recognize that public space has its own asymmetry. That the simple memorial act, the way we walk and sense of attachment to place, that act of walking becomes torture for some. You know, one man's waiting is the next man's loitering. And we say where that can get you. You know, it can get you in handcuffs if you're in Starbucks at the wrong time with the wrong employee. And so, you know what is the back again in a by way of imagination, to ask what it means when we say public space, to ask what things we're seeing and not seeing, and what might it mean to actually have a memorial or public space that acknowledges, you know, these different ways of inhabiting public space, these different ways of seeing and not seeing, the way we look at things differently. What might it mean? Let's say, you know, and I'm not a designer, so think of it as a 6-year-old, you know, walking in an architecture class, and it's a 6-year-old suggestion. But what might it mean to, for example, think of, you know, moving past the monument and there are ways of seeing it and sometimes having it blocked or not blocked. What might it mean to actually even think of the way public space sounds? You know, the different voices that are, you know, accommodated. I remember Karen Van Lengen, one of the professors here, had a class last semester interrogating different ways of imagining public space in Charlottesville and the memorials. And there's this fascinating project with one student that thought of cutting up the monuments and then suddenly having different sounds and different voices coming through. And you had a sense of moving through space with a variety of voices accommodated. It acknowledged that there are a multiplicity of voices at play, and that we need to hear these multiplicity of voices. So to move back to what some of the people were saying earlier, the importance of listening, the importance of recognizing these voices. Here's the Zewde refugee camp with Syrians rushing over the border in Libya. And one of the things we have to recognize is that you get a bunch of people together, the tendency is to urbanize. And so in no time they started having, in the grocery stores, they started having any number of things, they started having real estate in the refugee camps, so people recognize that it's, in a long stretch, things are worth more than others. They had made some announcement in Brussels that they were thinking of having bicycles coming to the refugee camp, and 4 hours of that announcement was made. There were 6 new bicycle repair shops. There were no bicycles in the refugee camp, but the bicycle repair shops that, you know, preceded them. And there were all manner of ways in which people were moving along. You know, but why all of this in something we're talking about Charlottesville? Because there's this lovely concept, and since I'm among a lot of landscape architects, you know, that lovely idea of the desire lines. You know it. You see all these great designs that are built on the campus and the walkway, and everybody ignores the walkway and it's like a cut through the grass. That's partially a failure of design, but fundamentally what it really is a failure of story. To ask, you know, how are people moving? You know, how are people moving along with their desires? Desire lines is people moving in that direction where desires are taking them. And so as we begin to start thinking, you know, don't look at the Lurban Commission, look at their recommendations, which I think there are a lot of rich word recommendations, but also look at the way in which these are coming out of deep listening, of listening to the various voices, the various experiences of what it meant to live in the city. You know, isn't it beautiful to, man, there are tons of scar trees around. The kind of ways in which we understand Charlottesville as us being in a landscape, and what's a persona and multiple personas at play. And so it ends up with something like this. I first discovered this place doing illegal things in Paris, going to the catacombs, and there's like a whole network underneath, and I was with a friend who's writing a book about underground places of the world, and so we were exploring Paris from underground and meeting all the immigrants who were there who were living underground. And then eventually this thing emerged. French speakers here, please do not get mad at me, like Grand Visionnaires or the Great Neighbors. And what it became was, it's a temporary camp in which we were looking at things like Zatari and other refugee camps, and where people's desires that align themselves to create shared space. And it's a space with 600 refugees, rough mix of refugees and new immigrants, at-risk youth, and suddenly they use the desire lines to then begin creating what it meant to coexist, what it meant to live in a place together, what it also meant to see the way Paris was and Paris inequalities and what it meant to actually coexist and to have multiple stories at play and to create a design. And it's a fascinating thing. I'm not getting a good enough photograph of it, but it's something that works. You walk in now into France in among catacombs in Paris, and you're seeing the very wealthy, you're seeing middle class, you're seeing refugees, and somehow it's this utopia, but it's working somehow. They found a way to coexist, which brings me back to that poem, which a lot of you might know from Richard Wilbur, student protesters, where he says, "Go, speak to those who are rumored to be unlike you, and you unlike them." And he goes on talking about what it means. But at a certain point in the poem, he hits to this beautiful line when he says, "Let the new sounds of our street be the sweet sound of your discourse." So that's part of your challenge, to actually use design to create a set of experiences, to be able to invite yourself into people's imagination and invite their imagination to write their many stories onto the landscape, but to also do so in a way in which you're finding ways to let the sounds, the new sounds of our streets, the new sounds of Charlottesville Street, with the sweet sound of your discourse. Wisława Szymborska, the Nobel laureate, the Polish Nobel laureate, who had seen not a few horrible things in Poland and was trying to always find ways to wrestle with how we can create a new Poland, and had this poem about the 20th century where she goes through and she lists all the horrors of the 20th century, and people asking, well, how do we move on from here? What do we do? And the poem ends with she said, and now as ever as always, the most pressing questions are the naive ones. So let us all together go and begin to ask these naive questions, basic questions like, what does it mean to walk through this space? What does it mean to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of alienation? How is walking a memorial act? How do we change something from a space into an actual place? How do we coexist? How do we make the new sounds, sweet sounds? And how do we actually get past trying to find ways of passing on knowledge and trying to actually find ways to engage the imagination? Thank you.
So we're well, I really appreciate the examples that you showed in thinking about how people shape the spaces and can do it quickly in a meaningful way, which is definitely counter to my let's put it into policy and make sure the thing happens approach. So it does make me question, I think both are needed in a sense. And I'm just like, I guess I'm so structure oriented where I'm like, so how can we make sure that we can have these pop-up spaces? Like you can't, it's just kind of organic in a way. It wasn't a question so more, it's just.
One of the things I'm thinking is that, for example, when you read Blue Ribbon Commission reports and you see what they're doing, there are so many people, and you'd also acknowledge this, there are so many people who actually avoid parts of Charlottesville because they don't feel welcome, they feel that they don't belong. And so maybe part of what we have to do in trying to even think of how to redesign is not merely to acknowledge ways that we're all to see the place, but acknowledge ways of not seeing, or ways of erasure. That people who erase certain parts of the city because they feel that the city has erased them. People who avoid parts of the city because they feel that the city has acknowledged, in its own tacit way, or not so tacit, have said, you don't belong. And so automatically you need to begin having designs that, let's say you could walk past and you could even have certain big long stretches where I don't have to look at that monument. And then other parts where you can see them and not see them. And to play with this idea of seen and not seen, erasure and non-erasure. In other words, those who feel that they've been erased or put in people's blind spots, what might it mean to start creating designs that allows them that kind of agency that, we can start erasing things also. We can start not seeing things we don't want to see. Or we can see things that acknowledge ways in which we've been erased and that invite us back in.
As you were saying it made me think about the folks who we've acknowledged on campus, and of course the the support staff and all the people of color who I see in the dining halls. I'm just like, wow, and like hearing and thinking about their voices and their visibility and invisibility too.
Yeah, that Capitol Hall, I was talking to this wonderful student yesterday who's working on a project in Capitol Hall and what to do with Capitol Hall. And Capitol Hall was built initially because they're like a way of noticing the black neighborhoods. But it's also like the way in which the lawn is built, is that you walk up the lawn and you end with a hallelujah moment. Oh! What if you were to start like playing with designs to sort of, you reach Capitol Hall and there's something architecturally that, instead of actually having you look up with your hands raised to Jeffersonian heaven, actually having you almost like look to the ground to acknowledge the landscape with its many histories layered with each other. That instead of an epiphany at the end, it's a kind of self-examination, a way of seeing, a way of acknowledging different. What if you found mischievous ways to block out Capitol Hall, to take Capitol Hall and bring it down to earth? Or what if you, for example, have a kind of feeling that I have that feels like architectural music? I'm like, I've been to Rome, come on. So what if you decide to play with these different ways of seeing it? Of those who see this as a poor facsimile, the way someone like me would see it. Or others who see, here's an erasure. What might it mean to sort of imagine what it looks like behind Capitol Hall, to admit that thing that's blocked out? Could there be designs done in front of Capitol Hall that acknowledges that world behind it, that does something that in effect pummels Capitol Hall? We can't do that for many reasons, but is there something we could do in terms of design that effectively said, oh, we just demolished Capitol Hall? What you're seeing here is a kind of view, is a life, is a way to extend our imagination past that structure and admit all those lives, all those communities, all those histories, all those memories, all those coexistences that Capitol Hall was built to block, to erase, to not acknowledge.
With that, we're going to restructure ourselves. And the power of rotation is happening. Everybody move back. Look at that. That was fun.
Yeah, it's kind of hard. Can we go this way?
The obstacle course. I feel like we're in pinup space now.
Did I want to start? Yeah, you have a question.
I don't know. I'm shocked.
Oh, yes. That's fine. I'm a yes. I prefer to you. Yeah. So sure. Okay. So in the time that we have left, any questions or comments as well in the audience?
I have a comment. I cannot sit up. One, I would just like to say, as a black educator and a black designer, this is a first. And my first 20 years teaching, I probably have one, Kofi, my radical brother here. But it's great having students in the past, Sara, offsprings of mentors, new revelatory voices, the Walker, that we share great stories, and then another educator. But it's a first for me. So you guys have one another, use one another. Some of us who came through, we were out there in the desert. The other thing is, I cannot sit here looking at these guys. Yeah. So can we make a circle? This feels really weird. Have all these brown people up here. Deconstruct this.
Yeah. This is liminality. We're liminal space now.
How's that going to happen?
Yeah.
I don't know, but just like,
Try.
direction.
Yes, and Howland. Come on, close. Yeah, where would you like it?
There we go, that's better.
Yeah.
Oh, that was
No, this is runway.
We did stick together quite a lot growing up. Okay,
Any questions? Comments? Yes.
I just want to say thank you to Amber for saying something that I've been thinking since I arrived on campus. It's something my partner and I have actually struggled a lot with too, and that's actually why we got moved to DC, because we just don't feel comfortable here. And I looked around and I've talked to a lot of people, and I was told, oh, you know, we are pretty diverse. But we're not. Like, look at the landscape program. It's pretty much all white people. And it's like we're not making an effort to bring in other voices. We're not making an effort to bring people to the table. Like, how can we change the future? How can we change what's going on? How can we change the conversation if we're not welcoming everyone in? We're not making an effort to bring everyone in. And the more I look around, I'm like, yeah, we are diverse. If you look at the people who are, you know, serving us every day, people who are cleaning the school, people who are making the food. You walk around Charlottesville, it's the same thing. It's the same structure. Everyone working at CVS pharmacy or working at restaurants. It's like continually perpetuated. And how are we actually like trying to change that and move forward? And I just want to say thank you so much.
I guess I have a follow-up to that. And this is for everyone, but it's like mainly for the former UVA students. Going off of your talk about recruitment and reaching out to HBCUs that have design programs and this sort of thing. And I was sort of like putting myself in that place. Is like, what if I were to go there? What would I say? And I have no idea what to say, because I would love to encourage students of color to come here, but then I don't know how to ask them to come to a place where they might feel comfortable every day when they could go somewhere that maybe they would be more comfortable. And to Kofi's point, like, Black people have done enough too, right? And so I don't know how to sell that. I don't know what the language is for that.
When I say that I'm a alum too, and I am a Black person, and I still don't know how to have those conversations sometimes. Because people say, oh, you went to UVA, why would you go there? And you're always justifying what it was. And like Amber said, there were 5 of us when we started. We graduated, there were 3 undergrads, Black girls. And it was hard on a daily basis. And it's still hard. Like, I just moved back here, so I'm trying to get my place now, have a family. And it's still hard to reconcile this Black professional when I know, like when I was here, I volunteered in a lot of low-income communities. And how do I go back and say, this is how you can be a mentor to those people, but not feel that like I'm trying to push something on them. So I think like you have those conversations, but we feel the same way. So don't feel like you're the only person. But I think just putting yourself in a position to do that is really important. Don't have that fear and to let it stop you. Like just put yourself in those awkward positions, because we don't want to assume that we know what somebody else wants. And I think a lot of times as designers, like I'm the only Black, well, we just had another Black person in my firm, but I'm in spaces all the time. I'm the only Black face, and I'm the only Black female. But I have to have those conversations with people that you can't assume that you know what these people want. Like you have to go out to those communities, put yourselves in those awkward positions so that you can be a better designer. So just make sure that you're doing that.
I think that there is something very basic that is for me. When I was chair, I was trying to have Black people. For me, was very weird because I belong to a place that we don't have this problem. But I think that it's a question also of critical mass of Black people that arrive to the top. I had a child that was autistic here. I had to live, so he had to live in the same way. So half of my family had to live in Spain because I saw how he was put apart with Black child, that I have no problem, but I saw at the level of the basic school in Charlottesville, this inequality that was very, very visible. So if we don't work on the basic of all of those children growing and really having the opportunity and being, in a way, helped because they belong to maybe to low-income people. So I think that the school, the basic school, it's the beginning of everything. So the education, basic education is what would make for me a difference in this country in general. So if we have more people are gonna be there. Because if not, I'm sorry, but you are really, you have a lot of value because there is few people that can be in higher education. So I think that this is something that we have to do, but we need more people that can be really there. And I think that basic education is key. It's a key point. I don't know if it goes to mindset with landscape architecture and design, but I really think that basic education is a challenge in this country.
I'd like to say also, I think we can't just have white landscape architects designing spaces for people who are white and also people of color. I think that's, I mean, there's so many reasons why it seems obvious that we need this institution to be a more diverse place, but it comes down to not wanting to design a space. I think Walter brought this up in his lecture as well, not providing in a fraternal way the spaces that you think people want because you don't know the community, you don't know that space, you don't have that lived experience.
One thing to keep in mind is that there are multiple conversations that need to happen, multiple questions. So in other words, this is not a discounted question. It's to say not merely how do I sell this to the potential black student, but it's to ask what stories aren't present here in which that person feel that they can't be part of a story that includes that. And then to ask who are the different voices that have something to say about the story. Like, you know, who are the different people that can actually help create that multiplicity of stories when it feels that they're part of the stories. In other words, is to ask, who else should I be talking to, you know, along with that black student? You know, might it work or help if I show up at a city council meeting? Might it help if I write a letter to the provost? Might it help if this organization does it or that does that? So in other words, rather than just see, find ways to like slot in a black student or a few black students or come to black students to recognize, just as was said earlier, any number of forces happening within the university, outside the context of the university within the city, and just start asking what different stories need to, present so someone can feel that they're part of the story rather than come in. They're all stories that are foreign to them or antithetical to them or alien to them. And so to ask, who should I be speaking to? What other stories should I be trying to actually have happening, along with that mirror that conversation between me and that black student?
I'd like to add to what you were talking about earlier, this idea of imagination, which I hadn't thought about a lot, but to be black in America, you need a lot of goddamn imagination. You have to imagine yourself coming from a place and ascending to another place where everything's against you. That takes a lot of imagination. When everything's against you, you have to become the Black Panther. But it made me also think about, on the other side, you have to see black people. You have to look at me walking down the street and go, that guy could be a professor. What's stopping you from looking at the tall guy, I love your story, who's getting out of the cab, landing here, walking across the mall, who's like 7 feet tall, and immediately go, oh, we have a new basketball player. I mean, what's stopping that imagination? And that's the thing that you gotta deal with and get past. Because you gotta imagine a little black baby being able to run this university. And if that can't happen, we're just gonna keep repeating the same cycle. And the beautiful thing about design school, it's all about imagination. And the reason why I got in this profession, Larry Halpern came to my all-black program in Greensboro, and he showed these projects to these 12 black students, and not once did he talk about race. He talked about art and drawing and scoring and all that shit. And I got excited. And then the next one came, and Friedberg came in and talked about play. And they showed these drawings, and we got excited. And during my entire 5-year program, we never talked about being a Black landscape architect. And now it's back to, how do we get Black landscape architects? You have no imagination, right? And as soon as you put Black there, that means you lost it. And so go to Tuskegee, show those students, and imagine the world. I guarantee you they'll come. But if we keep talking about this loaded question, you know, you're going to still live in this kind of marginal place. And it really is the imagination, because, I mean, I have clients who pay me to design for them in crazy places, and I have to think that they have imagination. You know, it's like, we're going to bring Walter to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. That's an imagination. Right? But you need that. And I think all of us, whether you're hired in different places, people have, somehow we've been able to present ourselves in a way that allow people to imagine us anew. And that's our experience here in this country. Right? We're constantly trying to get you guys, and I say you guys, non-brown people, Black people, to imagine us differently. And you hear these beautiful things. I remember this one book, Imagine a World, with beautiful photos of Black and white. I forgot when it came out. And I just wanted to just pour through that. Because these women, these workers, these laborers just portrayed in these images, and you can imagine that they were queens or whatever. That's what we do. I'm just trying to give you a little courage.
At a risk of, can I say something? Yeah. One of the things that you're asking, I hear so often, is this tendency to think of architecture maybe as at an institution or in a discipline. That in many ways, architecture is a set of roles, and architect's a role. There's an architect as manager. There's an architect as designer. There's an architect as advocate. There's an architect as analyst. And Kofi especially remember this role is architect as futurist. Yes. And increasingly in the architect as social entrepreneur. So you're interacting with people and go, oh, I said that social entrepreneurial side of you. Here are ways in which UVA is encouraging that role. Or the architects as analyst. Oh, there's that professor, that professor, that professor who this side of you. And so in other words, if an architect is in a bunch of different roles, and no one person embodies all of them, and in a certain profession, like you might move from one firm where you're main analyst, and next time you're advocate, the next time you're futurist. But you see different ways in people fulfilling these roles, or they're attracted to these roles, and you begin speaking of architecture in these different roles. So in other words, you accommodated somebody with a multiplicity of interests and abilities and presentiments, rather than just saying, oh, the Black architect, how do I work with this discipline or with this institution, rather than thinking, here are these roles that this person could fulfill. And of course, don't be fooled. Like, if they're going to ask you, well, what is it like being a Black person at UVA? You get to answer that question, you're like, well, I've counted the costs, but so much of what is we talk about the architect as analyst, I can find myself being satisfied at UVA. And it's not like when we talk to them, they're going to be having a ball of a time. There's no Wakanda anywhere in the US. So they're going to be having some sense of, yeah, I know what it's like. The place that I'm in right now, I have to deal with all of that. When I'm not at Howland, I'm back home in this suburb where I'm one of 6 people that get called for like every 5 days.
Can I just this is just a slightly different sort of addition to this answer, and I think it refers to something that Azzurra mentioned. I think when you're talking about sort of diversifying profession or recruitment, I also think it will require all of us to be very critical of the sort of the labor givens of this profession. People are not, it's a profession that relies on exploitation. And I'm saying this from the most privileged point of view, but I think being a designer in some ways, it lends itself to privilege because you kind of sign up for really, I don't know, years and years of kind of economic exploitation in some ways. If you're just looking at pay, benefits, it's a different conversation. But I do think it takes some serious reflection on how this profession is structured and how labor is valued and how how are you going to convince people who come from a variety of sort of socioeconomic backgrounds to dare go there?
I think Amber made the point too about kind of the loans and the debt, and Leah's point about, did I do this to be poor, right? Like there is that component of all these decisions that get made where, there's people in my family who are still quite upset that I am not an international lawyer because that is what you're supposed to do. And sort of, I think, the reality of those pieces and dynamics, and I think to me that's where I was trying to get with the idea that to get to a place where it's boring, where you can just be like, hi, I'm so-and-so and I want to do X, right? Like, I'm not the black one, I'm not the mixed race one, I'm not the magic one who defied everything, I'm not the one who had to do all the things to get me here and not make the one mistake that threw me off the track. I think to me that's where the boringness is, that you can just be like, I'm so-and-so and I would like to choose from these options. I would like to imagine myself in any of these, is getting to the heart of that, I think, for me, where it's like the burden is a lot. Let's figure out how to get to it. It's just boring.
Karen, you had your hand up.
Yeah, conversation. I have a question for the panel, and that is, what did all of you think when Obama picked a non-African American architect to design his presidential library? And this is not a critique of the firm he picked, but it's a critique of the decision not to promote African American architecture in America. That was a huge project, and there were a lot of people that could have done it. So how do you react to that?
I know UVA grad is working on it as part of the managing team, but actually who came from Tuskegee my next year, there was another one. He came in for the one-year master's program and is working at a firm in Chicago. So yeah, it's not the lead architecture firm, but there are black folks working on that project.
But one of the questions that comes up is how, I think David Adj's project in Washington is so important, not only because it's a spectacular piece of architecture, but because every school kid in Washington is going to that museum. And so they say, an African American is not from America, but has built this. They can imagine that they can do that too. And in the museum, I don't know that everybody knows this, there is no section on the history of African American architects or landscape architects anywhere in that museum. And so that's disturbing. Who gets to learn that that's an option in their life? So this is a huge issue.
Well, with the museum, they are collecting. So they, as part of the curatorial staff, they are collecting from African American architects and landscape architects and planners. So there will be a future sort of curated exhibit of that. To your larger question, I don't have a problem with the selection because I think once you go down that road, where do you stop to a certain point? And do we go back to separate but equal? This idea that, I'm building a house, I gotta find a black architect.
Yeah.
This idea, again, goes back to, I love this idea of imagination. Imagine the first black architect selecting a white and Asian person who does great architecture. But that needs imagination to begin to kind of talk about that there's this, I think, a larger thing that, what might it mean to have a good piece of architecture on the south side of Chicago, and how by grafting, by having Obama there, is there more opportunity for more people to get involved? And I think, again, you need imagination. Because I just think it's so complex when we start slicing and dicing.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off that because I live in Durham. I live within walking distance of Phil and Neva Freeline. And I co-taught with Zena Howard last semester from Perkins and Will, who's a UVA alumni. So politely, I would say David Adjei did not design that museum. He takes credit for it. But it was a team that included probably the most prominent black architect practicing now, Phil Freeline shop, and a prominent alumni of this program, Zena Howard. So what I would say is maybe as a cultural response, maybe it's letting go of the previous storytelling of the sole auteur, master designer, to which everybody else, genuflects. And that the contemporary reality is that we do everything in teams. And so acknowledging the team, I think, is important. There's a whole other conversation about President Obama in the library. He and Michelle did pick African American artists for their portraits. And that was a specific political decision. Kahindi Wiley and I can't remember the sister's name. So.
Amy Shepard.
Thank you. She actually has a nicer painting, no offense, but her painting is nice. I'm struck by they picked a husband and wife design team to lead. And when you look at the relationship between the Obamas and their identity as a collective unit, I interpreted it that way in terms of reflecting that in the leadership of how they wanted to put their thing together. It's a husband and wife sort of lead team. So.
I think it's also important to realize that Rick Scofidio, when he interviewed for the Museum of African American History, outed himself as a Black person whose family had passed. It's the first time he talked about himself as an architect of color. And I suspect if he talked about his work that way for the project he lost, he probably talked about himself that way with the Obamas. And so I think it's important that we don't assume things about people's identity, because I think that was, your dad, Maurice, was on that jury when that happened, and I remember Maurice saying, why didn't Rick say that when I was a student? Right. It would have helped me immensely, but he's in a different place personally.
I think there is a complexity to the petition. My point was that if you're trying to open the doors to a larger group of people to become architects and landscape architects, they have to feel that there's work out there by that group of people.
Okay, so
but I would
now it's
say
time to offer
anybody, I would say that anyone should ask that question then on any project anywhere today, right? Like, I don't know that the burden can only be on people of color to hire people of color. It sort of has to be like, we all have to, if we're doing this, we have to cultivate that pipeline beyond just what people of color can support. I think.
So it's been very positive so far. So as the interloper, I've been trying to be nice. It's time to get critical. So somebody that a few of us on the panel know, Arthur Jaffa, who was a cinematographer for a movie called Daughters of the Dust, and a pretty prolific creator. And he recently spoke at Duke University in Durham, in which he talks about Black creative production. And he singles out architecture and landscape architecture as being, if you look at creative production in other avenues, from music to visual arts to fashion, it's probably the best time ever for Black creative production, with the exceptions of architecture and landscape architecture. Because those are the only two that you can't rely on your existing social network to build the capacity to build projects. You're reliant on others. We got into a big fight about it, but I think that there's a kernel of truth there. Nationally, if you look at landscape architecture programs, what we've seen in the 21st century is the impact of gender and globalization on our profession, which is to say, if you go into most landscape architecture departments around the country, you're going to see a balance of people from other parts of the world, right? And you're going to see more women than you've ever seen in our profession, right? In the case of China, it's because landscape architecture is a tier 1 profession equal to medicine and law. It's a national priority. They don't have enough places to train landscape architects fast enough. They send them over here to do it, right? So think about that. There's a food chain, right? There's a demand. So to me, that's always been a challenge. And I've talked to Phil a lot about this particular topic, how long it took him, going from the Freeline Group to Perkins and Will to being able to arrive at the Smithsonian. It was a lot of work, but I think that idea of creating some gold at the end of the rainbow, such that there's a draw, and I think that that's an issue. There's some people who have been able to navigate. Walter is a great example of navigating that, but I think that if more people hired more designers of color, there would be more designers of color in college.
And pay them better.
And pay them better.
So sorry.
And I think another thing to keep in mind is that Black folks care about design in their places, like in land. I I was raised in Oklahoma City. My family comes from different parts of the U.S., D.C. and Oklahoma. And my aunts know the land like in ways that I don't. You know, when they pass away, they've already told me, I would take my ashes and scatter them on the farm. Like, that's what they want to do, both of them. We're gonna honor those wishes. The thing is, like, Black folks, and we hear it, deeply connected to the land. Just because we don't necessarily always think of it in terms of the categories that are talked about in architecture school doesn't mean that there is no interest there. That, you know, it's also about the way that you talk about the land, about the soil, about design building. I mean, Muskogee, Oklahoma, they tore down my grandma's house for a mall. Like, we know, we know what design does. And there's actually an antagonistic kind of spirit to it too. So I think it's a question of, you know, understanding. You all know what happened. You all know what happened with highways. You all know what happened with urban renewal. You know what happened with like poisoning of water and resources and things like that. So thinking about how to say, acknowledge, and understand that Black folks are like deeply tied to spaces and places and in ways that have like memory and the traumas are passed down and all that kind of stuff too, and say you can empower yourself in these kinds of ways. They're completely different categories. You know, my family is like, why you talk about urban renewal? That's Negro removal. Like, that's still how they think about it. And it's not, I think a lot of these conversations are like, wow, architecture and design are like so foreign to Black people. I'm like, you know, it's like, no, it's not. We know. We know exactly. And so even the imagining the trees, like, yeah, some people see the trees in the plantation go, isn't that beautiful? And I was like, ooh, people were hanging from those. Like, that's like my first thought, you know. Someone puts up the picture of Monticello. I'm on social media a lot. And on Instagram, someone was like, ooh, Jefferson was balling. And I was like, because he was a slave owner at the plantation. Be quiet, troll. I was like, we know. It's these things are real. And it's not foreign. It's just totally not foreign to us. I don't know. Just feel
To that effect, so I can only speak for myself, but I'm first generation Vietnamese, and I didn't apply to architecture school at first because I was embedded as a white thing. I do not have the agency to decide what spaces are going to be like. And then I decided to transfer over when I turned 21. And I don't regret it. I think I've learned so much. I've learned exactly what I want to know. But I was afraid to do it because it wasn't for me. So I think these memories of erasure and collective trauma affect your decisions as much as the representation in the field, as much as the representation in your surrounding social network. I want to say also thank you so much for being here. I think representation is way more than visual, and the feeling that is in this room, I appreciate so much.
Any last comments, questions? It's beautiful, thank you.
My comment is maybe naively positive about this experience, but the many powerful images, and we've all been speaking and using our hands, and the image of this gentleman in the center from Durham, when he said when somebody's in distress, the hand went down into the soil. Within that, I could imagine that I would plant a seed, and something would yield from that. And so we all come from out of Africa when people were smart enough to plant some seeds and have between the various civilizations, etc. So we all, in a certain way, share as human beings the necessity that they're partially removed from. And I live in a place called North Garden, Virginia, and I could say Charlottesville, I could say New York, but I live in North Garden, where I put about 25 years on my hands in the red clay, planted some peaches and some apples, etc. I've lived here longer than any other place in my life. I've been eating red clay, okay, for those years. And so it's in here, and I think we all share that from the purpose of making plays, which has the instrumentality of our hands. Not saying they got dirty, but that they yield an optimistic thing that goes across all of us for all of what we do, even if we come as strangers to a place and if you plant your seed. and then and you might defecate. The point is that we are part of that spiral, that looking back and forward, because take the chance to do that primitive primal activity. So I think these talks are great, and I think we're very proud of students and colleagues and strangers. And the last comment I have to make is, Alice Walker wrote, in Search of My Mother's Garden, that perfect and imperfect strangers would come by and admire her wherever she went, because she put her hands into poor soil and made something coming out. So making a garden, not just only with flowers, but making the thing that attaches us is much more powerful than that which we teach and that which we make to provide common ground, which was an attempt, an approximation on the rock. It's not successful because it was difficult, some of the white folks. But the point is making common ground is the imagination that's necessary rather than the particularization in my mind. One group or the other, so we do it together in a way. So it's been a very important thing for all of us, I think, in Richie's and for the school, to it's part of a continuing discussion, but I don't think it's just much. So, we thank you from the old folks.
With that, I want to wrap us up, but I want to say one story before I leave. The space, because I find it amazing. I'm trying to process still that my final review was on that wall in 1993, as they say it is. And during my interview, coming back to UVA, I sat in the Colonnade Club for the first time. Never gone into the ant plantation structure as a student at that level. And I sat and I looked at Jefferson's bust, and we had a little conversation with each other. We did. And so we stared, and I thought deeply about that moment when I did my job talk. And then I walked around the grounds, and I still felt unsure about my decision to come back and how so. And then I got to the Kitty Foster site, and I saw the landscape, I saw the work, I saw the architecture, I understood the meaning, I saw the acknowledgement, and it changed my entire perspective. So I have a personal thank you to you, Walter, because that work is also why I'm here. I left that site, and I said, all right, I'm back in. Time to go get it.
Yes.